time to be a little bit controversial with some of you. But I'm not just being controversial for the sake of it. It's something that I've long believed. The truth is sometimes people say you're left-wing or you're right-wing or whatever. Truth is most people are a sort of agglomeration of different views from different parts of the spectrum. I think it's fair to say this might be my most left-wing political view, but let me explain why. Let me give you some background to it before we start the conversation, because I know many of you will disagree, and that's fine. That's what this is all about. There have been suggestions in the last couple of days that the Chancellor is thinking about tightening up rules on inheritance tax, a tax which currently only applies to about 6%, 7% of all estates and raises about 10, 11 billion pounds a year. She's thinking about tightening up the rules to make it so that there's currently a bit of a loophole where if you gift someone something, then you do it and you don't die within 7 years, then basically it's no longer subject to inheritance tax, more or less. Chancellor apparently thinking about tightening up this rule. Now, there's a wealth manager. Weird they'd think this, isn't it? A wealth manager, Quilter, and the Centre for Economics and Business Research, a consultancy, has warned this morning that going after family gifts in an inheritance tax grab, as the Times puts it. Why is it always a tax grab, I wonder? Tax grab risks cutting struggling young families off from vital support. The typical pensioner gives 10% of their income, an average of almost $2,500 away to family each year, they say. And they say that if you were to change the rules, that basically young families would struggle. Rachel Griffin from Quilter says there's a strong economic case for supporting the transfer of wealth between generations. Weird that wealth manager would think that, isn't there? Oh, because the thing is, if you transfer wealth, who do you need? Oh, right, yeah, a wealth manager. Okay. Younger people face significant financial pressures, she says, from high housing costs to childcare and limited pension savings. So while older generations often hold substantial assets, sensible rules help to unlock this capital at the right time. Now, leaving aside the fact that there may be a little bit of touch of self-interest from Ms. Griffin from Quilter there, it's an interesting argument. She's basically saying that because generational inequalities are so severe, something that I talk about a lot and I have complete agreement with and concern about, the best way of addressing those inequalities is by making sure that some people from wealthy families and younger people can benefit from the inheritance of their forebears. Now, of course, this does pose the obvious question, or two obvious questions to me at least. One is, okay, but what is the kind of moral right to inherit? And second, well, what about everybody else, those who are not so lucky to have wealthy forebears? Let me just explain and give you some context in all of this. I'm a great believer that we need to have fewer taxes on earned work, on income. I think it's absolutely right. When the right say that we're overtaxed, they're correct. The numbers of people who are now being dragged, young people in particular, who are now paying higher rate income tax, is far higher than it was ever supposed to be or it ever was in the past. That is a situation which seems only set to worsen in the coming budget, with the Chancellor, I think, very likely not to change tax thresholds as would have been done in the past according with inflation. That was a cheeky little trick, nasty little trick that the previous Conservative government did again and again and again. So although you're not changing the top rate of income tax, in reality, what you're doing with inflation is dragging more and more people into it. You have got younger people who are starting their careers, sometimes paying marginal tax rates when you throw in their student loan, which has basically become impossible to pay off under repeated changes to the rules. You know, marginal tax rates of 30, 40, 50%, right? Meanwhile, you've got wealth, which is relatively untaxed in this country, and it is hard to tax. I appreciate that. It can be harder by comparison to income. But you've got older generations which are sitting on big, big assets and unearned income from those assets, which are being taxed at a far lesser rate. So we saw, for example, when Rishi Sunak published his tax return, that his overall rate of tax, given so much of his income was being generated by wealth, by unearned income, we saw him paying a marginal tax rate which was far lower, in the 20 or 30%, far lower than people who have no assets, working every hour God sends, day after day after day, just to put food on the table, who are on much lower incomes. This is a big problem. It's something we saw a picture of which was much more like the 19th century than the early to mid-20th century, when there was a huge, a sort of gilded age, the huge inequalities, particularly in wealth, where you had huge parts of the sort of upper echelons of society basically living off their wealth and their inner unearned income, while people lower down the chain had no wealth whatsoever. Let me give you some statistics on this. The bottom 50% of the population in this country own less than 5% of the country's total wealth, while the top 10% hold over 57%. That's up from 52% in 1995. The top 1% alone in the UK owns nearly a quarter, 23% of Britain's wealth. That is a massive difference and way more unequal compared to income, right? The wealth gap between the top and bottom 20% in this country rose roughly £7.5 trillion from 2011 to 2019. From 7.5 trillion to 11 trillion, largely driven by property values. There's huge regional disparities as well, right? So we're dealing with a context where there is truly enormous inequalities of wealth. And that has a big effect. It has a big effect if we hope in any way to achieve a truly meritocratic society. Why? Well, because if you have dynastic wealth, it entrenches inequality. Without high inheritance taxes, families just accumulate wealth and more wealth and more wealth, generation after generation after generation, regardless of their merit, regardless of their productivity, regardless of whether they're doing anything to earn it. They're just lounging around in their yachts off the Mediterranean coast, and they're just getting richer and richer and richer because the entire system is geared towards they're getting richer. Meanwhile, you've got the wage slaves out there, to put it provocatively, no wealth, having to pay higher marginal tax rates time after time after time on their income because they have no assets and they have no wealth. If you tax large inheritances properly, my contention to you is that it prevents an aristocracy of wealth from forming and it keeps opportunities open in society. What we've got at the moment is an aristocracy of wealth in this country. It's also true of the United States as well. So what I would do, and I wouldn't be opposed to, by the way, I wouldn't be opposed to 100% inheritance tax. Or maybe let's say 99%. You know, my rule might be that if you can put it in 2p bags, then you can hand it over. That's fine. 99, 95%. I'm being provocative, but you see what I mean. I would not be against a far higher rate of inheritance tax than we have at the moment, which is 40% above a certain threshold. I wouldn't be opposed to putting that to 50%, 60%, 70%. Why? Because I think the quid pro quo should be twofold. One, that helps fund public services, which actually helps level the playing field in achieving a true meritocracy. Two, it will help us reduce taxes on income. Because at the end of the day, I want to incentivize work. I want to incentivize productivity. I want to incentivize people to get up off their backsides and do more. That doesn't work when you have such a disparity between taxation on wealth and taxation on income. My contention is, and I know this is controversial, I know not everybody agrees with it, but my contention is this: you don't have a right to inherit. You should have a right to work while you're alive and keep more of your own money. That to me is more important, way more important, than your right to just inherit some money from mummy and daddy that you did nothing to earn. We need to move away from the rentier economy that we have moved to and move to a society where work is rewarded, where, you can keep more of your own money in your own pocket at the end of the month because you're working harder, rather than being faced with extra taxation after extra taxation after extra taxation. And just hope, as this silly little wealth manager seems to think, that your best hope will be just to hope that maybe at some point you might inherit some money from your nan and granddad or your mum and dad. What kind of society is that? And the thing is, if you go back, we've had those sort of inheritance tax rates before, by the way. This wouldn't be new. Actually, if you go back, the first estate duties that we saw were imposed in the early 20th century by the Liberal government at that time because they needed to fund the First World War. And you saw big estate duties. And actually, you had a lot of estates broken up at that time because you had, unfortunately, fathers and sons dying in the First World War from aristocratic estates. It was so controversial. Lloyd George famously said that he would tax the rich till the pips squeak. Likewise, after the Second World War, we had higher rates of inheritance tax. Guess what? Society was fairer. There was more of a meritocracy than there is today. There was less dynastic inheritance of wealth. So we're not talking about doing something new here. We're actually talking about doing something old. And I think that there is a very solid case, a progressive case, a case that everybody should be in favour of, not just a progressive case, but I think that if you're on the right as well, you should be in favour of people working harder while they're alive, not just inheriting something when your mum and dad are dead. I don't understand it. I understand that there are people that, people will say, look, I want to pass on something to my kids. I understand that. I mean, I still would be in favour of 100% inheritance tax, actually, because I actually think my kids, if I had them, I'd be like, well, go and earn your own crust. But, I can understand why you want to inherit something. But I don't see why you have a right to inherit. I don't think there is a right. I think you have a right to be expected to receive income, as much income as possible, from your own work, not from the work of somebody else. I think at the moment, this aristocracy of wealth that we are developing is making the whole country poorer, or at least the whole country poorer but them. So if the Chancellor wants to really, really be radical in this budget, then doing something like this, I think, would not only raise tens and tens of billions of pounds, but it would level the playing field for future generations. This is something, by the way, that previous, you go back hundreds of years, Enlightenment thinkers were thinking about all the time. Thomas Jefferson said that the land belongs to the living, not to the dead. He actually thought there should basically be a rearrangement of land every 17 years as a result of a census to make sure that we are not being governed by the decisions of our fathers and mothers before us. Because why on earth should someone who just happens to be... We've got people in this country today who are the great sons and daughters of grandsons and daughters of people who happen to do well in the Victorian period, and they're still living off the fat of their land. Why? What have they done to deserve it? Nothing. We're just expected to deal with it as if it's normal. It's only normal because that's the world that we've grown up in. And I think, and you've got societies in the world that do have far higher rates of inheritance tax, like Japan, for example, a dynamic economy. It works. We just think that there's a weird ability and a right to inherit. So why don't we actually start, and there's a generational element to this too, why don't we start moving the burden of taxation to wealth? People always say, how do you tax wealth? This is how you do it. This is how you do it. Your calls to come on this, I suspect that you might disagree, or maybe you agree. I don't know. Maybe I've convinced you. That would be nice.